it is time for our coolest subject yet. Get it? Because ice, cool. Alright, I'll see myself out. What's up, nerds? Today's topic is a particular interest of mine, the ice wall theory. Before we get started though, if you like all things human, archaeology, history, literature, and art, you're at the right address, so hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Before we begin, there's one thing I want to make absolutely clear. This video is meant to inform you what exactly the ice wall theory is, what its origins are, and to outline its main arguments. It is not meant to convince you of its validity or lack thereof. I have grown up alongside conspiracy theorist circles and have studied archaeology, so I've been on both sides of the argument, probably making me uniquely qualified to talk about a topic like this. If there is anything I've always found extremely lacking on both sides, it's people taking the time to explain in detail what we're arguing over. I found that the debates between scientists and conspiracy theorists are most often a game of he said, she said, usually with an air of superiority and antagonism. This video is not dedicated to those people. This video is dedicated to all the young Barts out there who just like to have some answers and some clarity, and to have someone explain it to them patiently and hopefully with some good humor. This video is going to be longer than what I usually do, so here's a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. First, there'll be a super quick explanation of conspiracy theories in general and general flat earth theories. Next, I'll give you some background information on the origin of the ice wall theory. Then, of course, we'll dive into what the theory is, what an ice wall is, and one of the major arguments usually posed in favor of the theory. Lastly, I'll give some of my own thoughts on the matter. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get started. The ice wall theory is one of the more well-known flat earth theories. In fact, it is the foundation of modern-day flat earth theories, and it dates back all the way to the 19th century. Flat earth theories are a small branch of conspiracy theories, theories that subscribe to the idea that a hidden but powerful organization, often the government or a general elusive they, is responsible for certain events or phenomena, often with a secret, malicious agenda. Multiple kinds of conspiracy theories are often related to one another, reference one another, have overlap, or build off of one another, which can make exploring or understanding them very confusing very quickly. Flat Earth theories are exactly as it says on the tin. The belief that Earth is not a three-dimensional globe or sphere, but in fact a flat surface or disk. The precise shape of the Earth, whether or not it moves through space, and its position relative to other celestial bodies like the Sun, the Moon, and other planets differ per theory. For the most part, they are based upon casual observation and scriptures from the Christian Bible. There does not seem to be much, if any, scientific or empirical evidence to support the theories, however. Important to note is how flat Earth theorists tend to look at the Earth, or rather, the parameters within which they concern themselves. The official Flat Earth Society puts it as follows. The Flat Earth Society primarily concerns itself with the known Earth, the area which the light from the sun affects. In other words, they concern themselves with the surface, the continents, and perhaps the parts of the ocean that are light enough to see in, but that's it. No deep sea, certainly nothing below the Earth's crust, and definitely nothing outside of the Earth's atmosphere. You'll note, perhaps, that these parameters only include the parts of our world that can be directly observed, hence the term the known Earth. As a side note, a common mistake, perhaps, which scientists make when arguing against flat Earth theories is by showing satellite images from space. Since space falls outside of the parameters the Flat Earth Society has set up, it is relatively easy for flat earthers to disregard anything relating to or originating from space. This is where the theories often overlap with other space exploration and Cold War-related conspiracy theories, like the fake moon landing theory. If you truly want to argue with a flat Earth theorist, you must stick to their parameters. Everything outside of those parameters can and will be disregarded as fake or unproved. Alright, so what precisely is the ice wall theory? As I mentioned, the ice wall theory dates back to the 19th century and was first proposed by a British man named Samuel Rowbotham. He first does this in a pamphlet called Zetetic Astronomy, zetetic meaning to proceed by inquiry, by asking questions. Later, he had the pamphlet published as a book titled Earth is Not a Globe. In it, he argues that the Earth is in reality a flat disk with the North Pole as its center. From there, all known landmasses expand southward. In this instance, everything in every direction away from the center counts as south, since the North Pole is the center. At the edge, the known world is surrounded by a massive 150-foot wall of ice, what we call Antarctica. Here's another point where several ice wall theorists disagree amongst one another. Is Antarctica the outer rim, or is it the seventh continent right at the front of the ice wall? And more importantly, what lies beyond this ice wall? Before we dive into any of these questions, I'd like to return to the theory's actual history, because Robotham also authored The Inconsistency of Modern Astronomy and its Opposition to the Scriptures, which explains a little more about where he got his theories from. I quote, "The Bible, alongside our senses, supported the idea that the earth was flat and immovable, and this essential truth should not be set aside for a system based solely on human conjecture." End quote. In other words, the foundation of the ice wall theory, which is in turn the basis for most other flat earth theories, is based on a book of semi-historical mythology, which had by that point already been edited, rewritten and translated over and over again, and casual observation. I feel the need to reiterate that this is not meant as ridicule or even as any kind of real criticism. I'm merely illustrating that the theory builds on shaky ground, and while that does not necessarily impact its validity, it must be taken into account nonetheless. In any case, Robotham founded the Cetetic Society in the latter half of the 19th century, which did become somewhat popular among like-minded people. They had a base of operations in England and in New York, and Robotham and other bigger figures within these circles published several other studies throughout the decades. However, the Cetetic Society faced a fatal decline in popularity during the First World War and was never quite able to recover. There have been several attempts at reviving the society in the last century, but none were ever really successful. Meanwhile, in the 1950s, another British man named Samuel Shenton founded another society for flat earth theorists, meant as a successor to Robotham's Cetetic Society. He called it the International Flat Earth Research Society, which is nowadays often shortened to the Flat Earth Society. Shenton was far more interested in science and technology than religion, and thus this new society steered more in that direction. This may have had a part in its initial popularity and support. During the space race in the 1960s, the society's popularity dwindled severely, and Shenton was known to criticize the images of Earth taken from space. After his death in the early 70s, the society was taken over by Charles Johnson from California. He became president of the International Flat Earth Research Society in America and a church. He incorporated religious elements right back into the mix of theories, and under his 30 years of tenure, the society gained well over 3,000 members. The society still exists today, and it's on their website where I finally gained some insight as to what the ice wall theory is actually about. Alright, cool. With all of that backstory into our pockets, what is the actual theory here? I'll let the Flat Earth Society explain. Quote, "Along the edge of our local area exists a massive 150-foot ice wall. The ice wall is a massive wall of ice that surrounds Antarctica. The shelf of ice is several hundred meters thick. This nearly vertical ice front to the open sea is more than 50 meters high above the water's surface." End quote. If you look at the map proposed by the theory, the ice wall is Antarctica. You can tell by the unique shapes just below South America and Australia. In this manner of viewing the world, Antarctica is not a roundish continent at the south pole of a sphere, but instead a sort of ring wall around a flat plane. I must point out that in the original description by the Flat Earth Society, they should say the wall of ice surrounds us, because in this configuration, it does. It does not surround Antarctica, because on this map, the implied land only extends outwardly. In order to reconnect with itself and thus be surrounded by the same one ice wall, it must extend back towards itself somehow, which is only possible in a three-dimensional body like a sphere, or a cube for that matter. On a flat plane, the land would only extend outwards infinitely, without end. I know what the society meant to say, but it's not what they said, and with such a simple mistake in language, they effectively disprove their own theory. Because I think it's important to also discuss the rest of the theory and its arguments, I'm gonna let it slide, but it's an important detail to bring to your attention. Moving on, it seems that someone has, in fact, encountered the ice wall in real life. The society mentions a British naval officer and polar explorer by the name of James Clark Ross. The following quote is a remark from Ross regarding this ice wall. Quote, "It was an obstruction of such character as to leave no doubt in my mind as to our future proceedings, for we might as well sail through the cliffs of Dover as to penetrate such a mass. It would be impossible to conceive a more solid-looking mass of ice. Not the smallest appearance of any rent or fissure could we discover throughout its whole extent, and the intensely bright sky beyond it but too plainly indicated the great distance to which it reached southward." End quote. According to the Society, Ross spent the next several years sailing around Antarctica to circumnavigate it and find a way in, but finding this way in proved an impossible task. And while Ross's description is certainly impressive, it cannot truly do justice to what the site must have been like. Here's a video from the Society's website itself of the ice wall as perceived from an airplane. I can certainly see why one might get the Truman Show vibes from encountering such a phenomenon. Speaking of phenomena, the Flat Earth Society makes a valiant, if somewhat confusing, attempt at explaining what exactly we're looking at. That makes sense. In order to argue for the ice wall theory, you need to understand how an ice wall is formed. In simple terms, an ice wall is the vertical edge of an ice shelf. An ice shelf is a layer of land ice that moves, either by growing or by sliding across land. The bigger the shelf, and in such cold areas they are usually meters in thickness and length, they are colossal, the slower it moves. The edge of such a shelf can be almost vertical, like a wall, hence the term ice wall. While ice shelves exist on land, they can of course encounter a shoreline. When this happens, the shelf is pushed off land and floats on the water. The piece of the shelf that's on the water is still connected to the ice on land. If a piece does break off, we call this calving. Antarctica's shoreline largely consists of these types of phenomena. Most of the shore is rock with ice shelves on top, but certain parts of the shoreline are actually just floating shelves, the rock of the actual landmass only starting several meters further inland. In this sense, the Flat Earth Society is not wrong in stating that we're not dealing with a single ice wall all along Antarctica's shore, but actually with several smaller walls located next to each other. The thing is though, that by calling the phenomenon a wall, we run the risk of creating an inaccurate picture in people's minds. The term wall implies that it is a separation or divider between one open space and the next, which is why you often hear flat earth theorists talking about beyond the wall. However, an ice wall is just the vertical edge of a plateau, the ice shelf, a layer of ground, I suppose, which is located above our own ground, kind of like standing in front of a podium. Do you see what I mean? But let's talk about another piece of information related to the theory. In my 23 years of living, I've met several people who at least consider the ice wall theory a possibility, and all of them have remarked the exact same thing. We're not allowed to fly over Antarctica. Why is that? The question is sometimes posed bitterly, sometimes with a conspiring grin, and sometimes just in plain confusion. And before making this video, I was always a little stumped on how to answer. The Flat Earth Society has also mentioned the issue, not with words, but with a link to a 30-minute video by Taboo Conspiracy. The Society thought it valuable enough to put it on their website with little to no added text, so I watched the whole thing. Once you get past the sneering tone of voice, the point of the video is this: independent travel is not allowed below the 60th south parallel. That is the lowest horizontal grid line just above Antarctica. Because of that, we cannot determine whether Antarctica is the outer rim of the known world or a continent right at the edge of the outer rim. The determination whether or not there even is an outer rim is out of the question. His map, however, clearly shows that Antarctica is the rim and not a separate continent at all. The first thing we need to determine is whether the main argument is true. Is independent travel over Antarctica illegal? The short answer is yes. In most cases it is. As Ben points out in the video, this is because of the Antarctic Treaty. So let's take a closer look, shall we? The Antarctic Treaty is a relatively unassuming document. The English portion of it only has 11 pages. The rest is a repeat of the same sentiment in 3 other languages. It consists of 14 articles, each of which describe a set of regulations regarding Antarctica. It was drawn up in 1959 and went into effect 2 years later, in 1961. It has been in effect ever since. The first countries to sign the treaty were Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the UK, and the US. Since then, another 45 countries have acceded to the treaty, although the regulations of the treaty are in effect globally. The first 3 articles sum up the basis of the treaty rather nicely. Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. The freedom of scientific investigation in Antarctica and cooperation towards that end shall continue, and scientific observations and results from Antarctica shall be exchanged and made freely available. Furthermore, the treaty prevents new territorial claims being made on the continent, but allows the existing territorial claims to remain unchanged. Since no one is boss over the continent, no one has the power to challenge the existing claims, but the existing claims cannot be expanded upon or taken over by others. In essence, no more fighting over who owns what in any way, shape, or form. Article 6 confirms what Ben also mentioned in his video. The regulations of the treaty apply south of the 60th south parallel, but not to the high seas in the area, only to Antarctica itself and all of its ice shelves. Article 7 makes it very clear that every single part of Antarctica, including all of its installations and equipment, are always open for inspection at any given time. In other words, don't even think about pulling sneaky illegal bullshit because you will get busted. The other articles are mostly bureaucratic in nature. Who is responsible for what, how to access certain information, and to ensure the treaty remains fair and up to date. I'll be sure to link the website containing the PDF file of the original treaty in the description for those who are interested in reading it. Around the 6-minute mark in his video, Ben makes the following remark.
The Antarctic Treaty was executed in 1959 and has been in place ever since. Think about it. No country had any real alleged concerns about the environment at that time. One of the more interesting facts is that the Soviet Union also ratified the treaty, and did so from the beginning on December 1st, 1959. Do you really think the Soviets were truly concerned about the penguins and the fragile Antarctic environment?
While this is meant as a gotcha statement, the answer really is no. No, the Soviets didn't care about the Antarctic environment around the time the treaty was drawn up. No one did. Because initially, the treaty wasn't about the environment at all. The Secretariat of the Antarctic Treaty has a separate Environmental Protection Protocol. This protocol designates Antarctica as a natural reserve, meaning there are strict regulations to its preservation and protection. The original treaty doesn't even mention Antarctica's flora and fauna at all, let alone any means of preserving them. But the Protocol of Environmental Protection, as it's called, was first signed in 1991 and didn't even go into full effect until 1998. It took over 40 years for people to even consider the Antarctic environment important enough to create a protocol for its preservation. So if that wasn't the primary reason for the treaty, what was? I think it might be time for a little historic context. Again, we can turn to Ben, who remarks that while the world was wrapped up in the middle of the Cold War, everyone seemed to agree that it was best to leave Antarctica off limits. And remember, the Cold War was much more than a tense face-off between the US and the Soviet Union. There was very much the same tension on both sides of the Iron Curtain in Germany and during the wars in Vietnam, Ethiopia, and Korea. There was the weapons race between the two major powers to have the upper hand at nuclear weaponry, and the space race to dominate the world beyond our atmosphere. In the midst of all of this lay one piece of land that no one had officially gotten their hands on yet, but with all of the polar explorations that had taken place in the early 20th century, that was quickly changing. Ben lays it out rather neatly with his next rhetoric question.
That's some peculiar cooperation transcending international conflicts, don't you think? Do you really think that the vast resources and strategic military benefits of Antarctica were multilaterally put aside because of penguins?
No, they were not. Everyone was aware of Antarctica's strategic position and military benefits, and that was the entire problem. Hell, the very first article in the treaty was constructed specifically to deal with this issue. Let's take a look. Quote, Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. There shall be prohibited, inter alia, meaning, among other things, any measures of a military nature, such as the establishment of military bases and fortifications, the carrying out of military maneuvers, as well as the testing of any type of weapons." End quote. They do quickly amend this by stating the military is allowed to assist in scientific research for peaceful purposes. In other words, it is made abundantly clear why the treaty was set up, not because of penguins, but because of the raging global paranoia during the Cold War. No one wanted anyone to have the upper hand, and the only way to ensure this was by making sure no one could get this piece of unclaimed surface. That is why neither the US nor the USSR likely had an issue with signing the treaty. It prevented the other from using Antarctica to gain the upper hand in their standoff. As for the independent part of independent travel to Antarctica isn't allowed argument, this I can only speculate on. It seems fairly obvious, however, that any country could use wealthy, powerful individuals to gain a foot into Antarctica, and thus use a sneakier, non-governmental approach to get the upper hand. History knows it wouldn't be the first or the last time such a thing was done. By having the treaty apply to everyone, this conundrum too is swiftly dealt with. It makes it legally impossible to gain control over the area in any way. The treaty, of course, still persists today, and Ben does a fairly good job at outlining just how damn near impossible it is for a random individual to just travel across Antarctica willy-nilly, even if he has a rather snide way of putting it. He takes you through the entire process of planning out a hypothetical journey to and through Antarctica, starting at the roughly 10-minute mark of the video. I must, however, correct him on just a few statements he makes while he does this. At 12:13, he says the following.
In summary, Antarctica is treated as a giant natural reserve. Like a military base, all activities and pathways in Antarctica must be approved. This is unlike any other area in the world, except maybe a place like North Korea.
He makes two comparisons here, neither of which are correct. A natural reserve and a military base are fundamentally different things. I don't quite understand where the comparison even came from. Second, Antarctica is unlike every other country or continent because it is a massive natural reserve. Antarctica does, however, function just like every single other natural reserve on the planet. You stick to the path, you don't litter, and you don't upset the wildlife. Next is the following, roughly at the 15-minute mark.
Entire swaths of land are entirely off limits to all travel. These are called specially protected areas. It's pretty much guaranteed that no one is going to get a permit to go through a specially protected area. If my math is right, that's 1,373 square miles that are allegedly specially protected areas. You can see the maps on the websites, but I don't have time to plot all of them. Now, I agree that's not huge in comparison to the total alleged area of Antarctica, but I believe there's a distinct possibility that those swaths of land could be coordinated in such a way as to prevent me from going through Antarctica easily.
It is true that certain areas of Antarctica are entirely off limits, usually due to its ecological, scientific and/or historic value and/or fragility. And as Ben himself acknowledges, these areas are pretty small when compared to the rest of the landmass. The problem here is that he makes an assumption based on nothing but his own preconceived notions. He claims he didn't have the time to plot the areas, which may or may not be true, but it took me maybe 10 seconds to find the maps. No matter which way you see Antarctica, as a roundish continent or stretched out landmass, there is no way in which these areas would prevent you from traveling to the center or edge or wherever you want to go. It may seem unnecessarily nitpicky, but it's important to remark upon. Ben makes several claims and presents them as fact when they are either based on nothing or downright incorrect. It paints a flawed image of the situation and undermines his own argument. When watching his otherwise pretty decent breakdown of traveling to Antarctica, in case you're interested in what the process entails, it's important to remember that not everything he says is factually accurate. Having said all of that, it's not entirely impossible to travel to Antarctica. In fact, the tourism department is alive and thriving, with the continent seeing over 70,000 tourists a year these days. Yes, there are restricted regulations on where you can and cannot go, and much of the continent really is off limits to the random visitor, but it's not like you're prohibited from going there at all. Antarctica isn't nearly as secretive and elusive as the theory seems to imply. And that's not to speak of the countless of scientists that have visited and worked on the landmass in the last century. Hell, there are people working there today. Now that I've given you most of the relevant information in regards to the ice wall theory, what do you do with it? I'd like to reiterate that the point of this video is not to convince you of anything, one way or another. The point is to give you enough information to make your own judgment. Like I said, a younger version of me could have really used videos like these that really go into the depth of explaining what these theories are about, as I try to navigate these half-explained theories and vague arguments. But I do have some thoughts of my own on the matter, and if you'd like to hear them, be sure to stick around. First of all, having skimmed over countless of maps of Antarctica, I think I understand where the base principle of the ice wall theory came from. When you look at a standard world map, what does Antarctica look like, if it shows up at all? A stretched out landmass at the bottom of the map. I can see how one would, when rearranging the map into a Robotham style map, draw Antarctica as a ring surrounding the known world. It makes sense. The thing is, however, that a standard world map isn't accurate to real life. It's all a little stretched out and warbled. Antarctica has been circumnavigated, sailed around and thus its edges mapped, by James Ross, and it has been flown over with aircrafts by Admiral Byrd among others. Admiral Byrd is also mentioned by Ben in his video. He was an American aviator and polar explorer who organized 5 Antarctic explorations. We know what Antarctica looks like from above without using satellite images from space, and Antarctica is round. It is a roundish landmass surrounding our planet's south pole. Knowing that it is round, and knowing that Ross circumnavigated it, it's a piece of cake to figure out its dimensions. Again, Ross and Byrd are both people mentioned and revered by the Flat Earth community. They operate within the set parameters of what the Flat Earth Society accepts as the known Earth, and their findings point to Antarctica being a round, known landmass, not a ring wall of unknown proportions. I really think the basis of this theory is a misunderstanding of what Antarctica really looks like, simply because we never really see it represented accurately. I'll be real for a second and admit that I didn't know Antarctica's exact shape until I started researching for this video. What's even more interesting to me is another one of Ben's remarks. In order to explain how an Earth according to the Robotham style map could work, he uses the concept of a ring magnet.
Like a ring magnet, north constitutes the center of our flat Earth map, and south is every direction away from the northern center. And before I get a dozen comments claiming that such a magnet is impossible, here's a ring magnet shown here. Notice that south is in every direction away from the center north magnetic pole.
I'm not entirely certain why he chose the ring magnet to illustrate his point, because that implies we walk on the sides of the Earth disk, not on the surface we see on the map. Or we'd all be drawn towards the North Pole since that's where the center of gravity would be, and that's observably just not happening. But the interesting bit is, whenever I discuss a globe versus disk debate with flat Earth theorists, they seem to sort of fall back on the old concept that gravity could not work in the way we currently describe it. They say things like, how would we not fall off the sides? Or gravity goes down, not inwards. It can't go down on different sides of a globe simultaneously. But by demonstrating the concept of a ring magnet, which is a real thing that exists, you're already halfway to demonstrating how a spherical Earth can actually exist. Just take the concept and make it three-dimensional. That's all. For the record, I think the Earth is round. I have no reason to doubt satellites, modern space explorations, and astronauts in orbit around Earth, because, frankly, what would be the point? Why go through all of that trouble to fabricate and lie and deceive to hide the truth about a flat Earth? To me, it seems more like the founders and firm pushers of the theory started on the belief that the Bible, again, a book of semi-historical mythology, is true, and started looking for arguments to try and prove themselves right. This as opposed to starting with a blank slate and looking at the evidence and arguments objectively. After looking at it from both sides, examining only the evidence within the limited parameters set up by the Flat Earth Society to give them the benefit of the doubt, I still see no way the theory has any legs to stand on. But I urge you, don't take my word for it. Like I said, I'll link all of the websites that I used in my research in the description below, so you can have a look for yourself. If you're truly that determined to find the truth, whatever that may be, then do your own research. You have your own noggin. Use it. After all, a researcher doesn't base their convictions on hearsay and other people's beliefs. And one more thing, while we're at it, can we try to be a little less hostile towards each other? The giving snide remarks and hurling insults at each other's heads is giving primary school. You feel me? If someone is deliberately antagonizing you, you're not very likely to listen to them. But then you give the exact same attitude in return but expect them to listen to you? Like, what's not clicking? You feel me? Being a SAS master may be iconic, but people will be far more preoccupied with how you sound rather than what you're saying, and so your point is ultimately lost. If you can't be civil for the sake of being civil, then be civil for the sake of bringing your point across. That's all. Got it? Good. But that's all I've got for you today, nerds. See you next time. You're barely gonna see me this episode. Most of it is reading, but that's because I want to get everything across as accurately as possible. And memorizing these lines is super fun, but in the interest of authenticity and getting my words across as accurately as possible, most of it is going to be reading, so you're not going to see me. I'm sorry.